Today's lecture is actually going to be a fairly short one. And that's because Chapter 14 is talking about applying extinction. And we've already talked about extinction on its own, so this is more just a refresher of what extinction is, and then talking about our functional use of extinction, usually as a follow-up to some kind of functional assessment like we've just talked about in the previous chapter. So as a brief refresher, this is straight out of our extinction slides in Chapter 5, I believe it was, where extinction is the procedure of withholding reinforcers that maintain a behavior. So if a pigeon is being given food after pecking a key, and they will peck and peck and peck and peck for to get food for pecking that key. If we employ extinction, which would mean that they peck the key but no longer get food, we would see a drop off in the amount of pecking behavior that we observe because that behavior is no longer being reinforced. Instead, it's being extinguished. And once that behavior has dropped off, once they have stopped that pecking behavior, we can say that extinction has occurred. Now, when most people think about trying to stop problem behaviors, the first thing that pops into their minds is punishment. And punishment is one way that you can decrease the likelihood of a behavior occurring in the future, but so is extinction. And so we're going to talk about some functional and non-aversive treatments, things like extinction, differential reinforcement, and antecedent manipulations, before we actually get into punishment. And that's because these types of functional and non-aversive treatments are preferred to punishment. So when we say that something is functional, we're basically saying that it's based on a functional assessment of the information in the situation we're looking at. So we can identify the antecedents and or consequences in a functional assessment, and then we can choose to alter those in such a way as to reduce that behavior. These are also going to be non-aversive because they're not involving punishment procedures. As we mentioned earlier in the course, punishment is something that has to be very carefully used. There are ethics involved in using punishment, and if it's not the best course of action, you absolutely want to use a different alternative procedure. And that's where extinction comes in. We're going to be talking about differential reinforcement a little bit today, but in a lot more detail in Chapter 15. We're also going to talk about antecedent manipulations in Chapter 16. So today is all about extinction, and that's why the chapter is fairly short. While we're talking about those three types of procedures separately, they are often used in conjunction with one another. We tend to use extinction, differential reinforcement, and antecedent manipulators all together. And as I said, they're the first choice for decreasing problem behaviors because they are non-aversive. We only switch over to those more intensive or restrictive types of treatments if these functional non-aversive treatments are either unsuccessful or if we can't employ them for whatever reason. There are certain situations where it just isn't viable to use these options, but whenever possible, you want to start here. So in order to actually employ extinction, we want to look at a couple of important considerations, stuff that we need to keep in mind before we can actually use extinction in a situation. So step one is to make sure that you've actually identified the reinforcer or reinforcers. Sometimes situations can be more complicated and have more than one reinforcer. So this is where that functional assessment comes into play. You want to understand the system and know what it is that's driving this problem behavior. And once you've done that, you absolutely need to make sure that the change agents, which are the people who would be implementing that extinction protocol, that they can actually control the reinforcer. There are going to be some situations where, again, it isn't viable to actually manipulate that reinforcer. Which leads us to the second point, which is the question of, is it even possible to eliminate those reinforcers? or the reinforcer, depending on the situation. Sometimes we're going to identify the reinforcer and find that maybe it's an intrinsic part of the behavior that's being completed. Maybe there is no way to get rid of it. Or maybe it's just not safe to eliminate that reinforcer. An example would be if a child is misbehaving by running out into the road, and the reinforcer in that situation is the attention that they get if you go out and take them out of the road. You can't eliminate the reinforcer of giving them attention, because if you do that, then you're leaving the child in the middle of the road. So it wouldn't be safe to actually do that. So in that kind of a case, you're going to find some other kind of functional procedure to use instead. Maybe we'd use antecedent manipulations or differential reinforcement. We can sort of progress through all of our other options, because extinction wouldn't work in that case. This is also a good time to note that we really want to make sure that we have identified the correct reinforcer. You want to make sure that you've done a good job of that functional assessment, because if you proceed with the wrong reinforcer in mind, then your extinction procedure won't be effective, because you're not actually targeting the thing that's driving this interaction. So you want to make sure that you've done a good job up front, so that you're actually extinguishing the correct the behavior correctly using the correct reinforcer. And just another quick reminder of stuff we've already talked about. For different types of reinforcers that we can see, we can have social positive, social negative, automatic positive, and automatic negative reinforcers. So things that are externally driven or internally driven, and whether they're driven by positive stuff being added or negative stuff being taken away, all of those are going to apply here. So we've already kind of talked about an example for social positive reinforcement. That would be something like getting attention. So extinction for getting attention would be ignoring the individual. So by not giving them attention, then you are employing extinction there. For social negative reinforcement, we might have an individual who escapes from tasks. So if they perform a problem behavior, maybe they get sent to their room and then don't have to do the task that they were asked to do. So that would be an example of social negative reinforcement, because, say, their parents are mediating that situation. And then for extinction, what you would do is not allow them to escape from performing the task. So you keep them from going to their room. You make sure that they complete the task. For automatic positive reinforcement, we could have something like sensory stimulation. So hearing or feeling something in the environment, that can be reinforcing. And so to remove that, maybe you remove the feeling of whatever that is. So if a child is engaging in self-harming behavior, say by banging their head on the table, then maybe you make the table softer, put out a pillow, or maybe give them a helmet so that they can't hurt themselves. So by removing that sensation, you're removing that positive reinforcement. And automatic negative reinforcement, we might see something like relief from anxiety. So maybe doing something relieves anxiety. And for extinction, you could prevent that relief. Though, for ethical reasons, it might not be a good thing to prevent that kind of behavior. We'd have to look at the situation by situation basis. But yeah, so those are the 4 kinds of reinforcers that we might be seeing, and just some examples to help you kind of visualize what those might look like. All right, so back to our important considerations. We've already kind of touched on sort of the idea of safety, but this is going to be not just are we capable of removing that reinforcer, but is it safe to use extinction overall? So as you might remember, when we talked about extinction, there's this idea that extinction can lead to some fairly violent outbursts, or even just emotional outbursts, things that can be different than the behavior that we had been seeing previously. So a child who is temper tantruming to get a toy, if you stop giving them their toy, they might switch from just crying to maybe screaming, maybe throwing things. They're going to change up their behavior. So we can see emotional responses. We'll see extinction bursts where they can become more aggressive or more loud or more something. And we'll see that behavioral variability where they're doing different things. So you need to make sure that people are capable of handling that. So in these sorts of situations, you want to have your change agent, again, the individual who's going to be performing that extinction procedure, you want to inform them that there's the possibility for escalation. You want to make sure that they're prepared for that. You have to instruct them to persist in withholding. You want them to stay strong with that extinction procedure. You don't want them to give in, or else they'll be reinforcing more extreme behavior. If the escalation becomes harming or can be harming, you should have a plan in place to try and eliminate or minimize harm. Things like having a helmet or some kind of protective gear. And if you can't meet any or all of those things, then it's probably not safe to use extinction, and you should pick a different method to get rid of that behavior. Our next point is asking yourself if you can actually apply extinction consistently. I had just mentioned where if you can't hold to that extinction procedure, if you can't continue withholding reinforcement, you can accidentally reinforce more extreme behaviors. The same is for all situations. Any time that you end up giving reinforcement, you're going to be reinforcing that problem behavior all over again. And for extinction to work, extinction has to be consistently applied. There can't be any slip-ups. There can't be any differences in application. So this is especially important with, say, children. They have two parents in a lot of cases. And if both parents are not using extinction, then it's not going to work. But if both can agree to use extinction and are consistent in it, then it's going to be a lot more effective. So you have to make sure that there is no reinforcement at any point during this extinction procedure, or else the behavior will reoccur at a pretty aggressive rate. In a lot of situations, to try and have that consistency, change agents will end up being trained to use that procedure correctly. So if you're using extinction in, say, a professional setting, maybe you're working with individuals with disabilities, people who are handling this procedure would be trained formally on what to do in different situations so that they're always consistent in how they act. And that helps with consistency. And then our last point is to check that you have procedures in place to promote generalization and maintenance. And I'm realizing that I was silly and I inserted one extra slide in between mentioning generalization and maintenance for the first time and actually talking about it. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop over this slide right next here and go to generalization and maintenance, and then we'll just backtrack. But generalization, as we've talked about before, is the idea of wanting this extinction to occur in all situations. So if you want procedures that encourage generalization, then you're going to want to make sure that you're conducting extinction in all possible environments that the problem behavior might occur in. So if your child is having temper tantrums, if they're doing it at school, then you're going to want to go through an extinction process at school. If they're doing it at home, you want to do it at home as well. Anywhere that that behavior crops up, you're going to want to have this extinction process. Otherwise, extinction tends to be fairly specific, and if you only use that procedure, say, at home, you might still have problems at school. So if you want that generalization, if you want it to apply everywhere at all times, then you want to do the procedure everywhere at different times. For maintenance, this is the idea of keeping that extinction ongoing to make sure it doesn't reoccur, to make sure there's no spontaneous recovery. And to do that, you just conduct extinction anytime the problem behavior reoccurs. So if a behavior was extinguished and then a couple of days later they start doing it again, you would just continue with the extinction procedure. You would continue ignoring the child throwing their temper tantrum or whatever it is that you're extinguishing. And the more often that you are able to consistently ignore it or consistently extinguish it, then the longer that that behavior is going to stay extinguished. So maintenance would just be to make it last longer, and generalization is to have it apply in all different scenarios. All right, so now, as promised, we're just going to backtrack and talk very, very briefly about schedules of reinforcement. And this is more a reminder than anything. And this is the idea that if your problem behavior was on a continuous reinforcement schedule, meaning that every time they did it, they were reinforced, then that behavior is going to be a lot more prone to extinction. It's a lot easier to extinguish a continuously reinforced behavior. And that's because they're used to getting reinforcement every single time they do it. And so when they stop getting that reinforcement, it's going to be a lot more apparent and a lot more noticeable. And so they're going to adjust their behavior more quickly. In contrast, intermittent reinforcement schedules make individuals a lot more resistant to extinction. And that's because they're used to not getting reinforcement every single time. So if you start an extinction process, they're not sure if this is actually extinction or if they're just in one of those dry spells and they might still be reinforced in the future. So intermittent reinforcement makes the behaviors a little bit more persistent and a little bit harder to extinguish. So it's always a good idea to know what you're dealing with before you get into it. All right, and then at the very end here, I just wanted to cover a couple more examples just to get you thinking about how extinction can work in different scenarios. Both are coming from the textbook, and this chapter has a whole bunch of different examples if you want to go over a couple of options to get comfortable with these. But we're just going to pick two because it seems like a good number. So the first comes from the very beginning of the chapter. And so we can talk about Willie, who makes loud, offensive comments when asked to perform tasks. And in trying to correct this behavior, where the staff would tell him, that's offensive, you can't say that, or to get into sort of arguments or disagreements with him to try and fix that behavior, the staff actually ended up accidentally reinforcing the behavior with attention. And they confirmed with a functional assessment that it wasn't just that he got to avoid doing the task, it's that he enjoyed the interaction, he enjoyed the attention, because he would eventually go and complete those tasks. So attention is the reinforcer here. And so to extinguish the behavior, the staff collectively worked together to ignore those outbursts, and they also ended up positively reinforcing other behaviors. So differential reinforcement of other behaviors to sort of encourage him to do something other than his outbursts. So whenever he would actually do the task that he was asked to do, they would praise him and give him attention. But if he had an outburst, if he made loud, offensive comments, they would just ignore him and walk away. And they made sure that everyone on the staff knew how to do this behavior and had practiced doing this behavior so that nobody else would be reinforcing this kind of action. And eventually, Willie made fewer and fewer remarks. The behavior was extinguished. Another example, and I found this one interesting because it's not attention, which seems to be the most common of examples. But this is the idea of a child spins a plate on the table. So I guess they just have a table maybe in a classroom or something like that, and the sound of a plate spinning on the table makes the child happy. They enjoy hearing that sound. But as you can imagine, it might be really annoying to have them constantly sitting there spinning plates on a table. And if they were doing this at home, they might break plates or something like that. So this is labeled as a problem behavior, and to extinguish this behavior, the teacher ends up putting a carpet on the behavior, puts a carpet on the table, which stops the sound of a spinning plate from occurring. So the child could still spin the plate, but it wouldn't make the sound, so there wasn't a reinforcer anymore. And as a result, the child stopped spinning plates on the table because the behavior was extinguished. So just a slightly different example there. And as I said, there's a bunch more of these examples in the textbook if you want to work through a couple just so you're comfortable with them. That would be a great place to start. But yeah, that's it. Today is, as I said, a very, very short chapter. So we'll pick up next time on chapter 15.